The reflection of fluorescent lights danced across the still damp marble, creating an imperfect mirror where Miriam saw nothing but the blur of her own silhouette. It was 5:30 in the morning, and the silence of the 50th floor had that almost sacred quality, as if the city below was still asleep, unaware that some people had already been working for hours to make everyone else's world start out spotless. She wiped the floor in slow, circular motions, methodical, almost meditative, while her thoughts wandered far from that empty hallway. The scent of cleaning products mixed with the faint aroma of coffee cooling in a plastic cup beside her had become the fragrance of her routine, a strange blend of effort and resignation she had learned to call life. Miriam wasn't the kind who complained. She never had been. Since childhood, she'd learned that complaining changed nothing. It only made everything feel heavier. So she observed, took notes, absorbed. In the pocket of her navy blue uniform, she always carried a small, worn notebook where she scribbled down ideas no one would ever see, sketches of how to improve the building's ventilation system, notes about elevator glitches, mental calculations she made while vacuuming. She knew she was smart, but she also knew that intelligence, when wrapped in a janitor's uniform, was often treated as a coincidence, as if it were impossible for someone who cleaned bathrooms to understand engineering. And maybe that was why she never showed the notebook to anyone, because silent rejection hurt less than rejection spoken aloud.
That morning, however, something broke the routine. Miriam was finishing up drawing the corridor when she heard hurried footsteps and the hoarse voice of Alessandra Norris, her supervisor, echoing through the glass walls. "Miriam! Miriam, where are you?" There was urgency in her tone, but not anger. Alessandra never yelled out of rage, only out of a concern that disguised itself as impatience. When she finally found her, the older woman held a clipboard as if it were a shield. "Look, I know it wasn't you, but Richard said the soap dispensers in the executive restroom were empty last night, and guess who's getting blamed?" Miriam felt her stomach tighten, but kept her expression neutral. Of course it would be her. It always was. Richard, the night supervisor, had a convenient habit of forgetting his own mistakes and redistributing them among the invisible ones. She wanted to say something, to say it wasn't fair, that she always double-checked everything, that Richard spent half his shift on his phone while she carried the weight of two. But the words got stuck in her throat as they always did. Instead, Miriam just nodded, slipped the notebook back into her pocket and muttered a quiet, "I'll take care of it," which sounded more like surrender than commitment. Alessandra sighed, touched her shoulder with a tired sort of tenderness, and walked away, leaving Miriam alone again with the gleam of the floor and the echo of her own thoughts. And it was there, between the silent injustice and the distorted reflection on the ground, that something inside her stirred, a whispered, almost inaudible promise that one day, somehow, she wouldn't be the invisible one taking the blame anymore. But the day wasn't over yet, and when the intercom announced an urgent cleanup on the 50th floor, just minutes before an important meeting, Miriam knew the universe wasn't done testing her.
The rain began slowly, like hesitation itself, before gathering courage and turning into a steady drumming against the windows of the 50th floor. Miriam pushed the cleaning cart down the hallway, and every drop sliding down the glass seemed to carry a fragment of New York's gray sky, that heavy kind of gray that made the city feel smaller, more intimate, almost vulnerable. She stopped for a moment in front of the panoramic window, watching how the water distorted the lights of the neighboring buildings, transforming the urban landscape into a blurred, impressionist painting. There was something hypnotic about it, something that made her forget, for a few seconds, that she was there to work and not to marvel. But the sound of distant voices pulled her back to reality. Deep, confident voices, the kind that fill rooms and make decisions affecting thousands of lives without a flicker of doubt. She entered the conference room with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. The executives hadn't arrived yet, but their presence was already there, in the leather folders on the table, in the crystal glasses aligned with surgical precision, in the scent of imported coffee someone had brewed before her. Miriam began to clean, moving like an efficient shadow, when fragments of a conversation drifted through the corridor. You need to impress Omar, Charles. He won't accept anything less than perfection. The voice was female, firm, almost protective. Miriam didn't have to see her to know it was Maggie Rahman, the CEO's personal assistant, a woman who, according to the cleaning staff's whispers, was more feared than the boss himself. Then came the reply, a man's voice, low, controlled, carrying the weight of someone who bore the world on his shoulders but could never show it. I know, Maggie, but impressing someone isn't the same as bowing down.
A chill ran down Miriam's spine. There was something in those words, a tension, a quiet struggle she recognized because she fought her own every day. The difference was that Charles Caldwell waged his battles in boardrooms with city views, while hers were fought among buckets and mops. Alessandra appeared at the door carrying extra towels and noticed the distant look on Miriam's face. "Don't let these people get in your head, girl," she whispered, setting the towels on the side counter with a gentleness that softened the edge of her tone. "They talk about power, status, million-dollar contracts, but at the end of the day, none of them know what it's like to wake up wondering if there'll be bread on the table. You've got dignity, Miriam, and that doesn't depend on what floor you work on." The supervisor held her face for a moment, forcing her to meet her gaze. "Listen to me, you're worth more than you think." But was she? Really? Miriam wanted to believe it, wanted to feel that somewhere in the world her worth wasn't measured by her invisibility. As she adjusted the chairs around the table, each one placed at a perfect angle, like soldiers ready for corporate battle, she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it would be like to sit in one of them. Not to clean, not to serve, but to belong. To have a voice. For her ideas to matter as much as the name embroidered on someone's suit jacket. The rain kept falling outside, washing the city of its daily impurities. But Miriam knew some stains couldn't be washed away. They needed courage. And courage was exactly what she was still learning to find. The sound of footsteps echoed down the marble corridor, accompanied by deep laughter and the confident stride of expensive Italian shoes. Charles Caldwell was arriving, followed by Omar Al-Fahim and Maggie Rahman, and Miriam, still holding the cleaning cloth, realized that the stage was set for something that would change everything.
The sound was as sudden as it was mortifying, a sharp metallic crash that sliced through the air like a shout, followed by the splash of water spreading across the marble floor. Miriam had tripped over her own cart in her rush to leave the room, and the bucket toppled with disproportionate force, spilling soapy water into a puddle that seemed to grow in slow motion, creeping dangerously close to the executive's pristine shoes. For a second that felt like eternity, everyone froze. Charles Caldwell with his hand still raised mid-gesture, Maggie Rahman, eyes wide, clutching a folder as if it were a life raft, and Omar Al-Fahim, the Arab investor in a charcoal gray suit and gold cufflinks, with a slow smile forming at the corner of his mouth, a smile that held nothing kind. "Well," Omar said, dragging the word with a refined accent that made even mockery sound elegant, "it seems American efficiency comes with free entertainment." He took a deliberate step back, avoiding the spreading water, and crossed his arms as he watched Miriam crouch to pick up the bucket. Her cheeks burned. She could feel the heat crawling up her neck, coloring her skin with a shade of red that betrayed every ounce of humiliation. "You know," Omar continued, his voice filling the room with an authority that needed no volume, "I've always wondered how a building like this runs. Complex systems, automation, cutting-edge technology, and yet we still rely on buckets and mops." His eyes met hers, and there was something cruel in that look. Not hatred, but indifference, which was far worse. "Tell me something, my dear. Do you know how this floor's air system works, or do you just clean without thinking?"
Charles frowned, visibly uncomfortable. Omar, that's not— But Miriam cut him off. She hadn't planned to. The words simply slipped out, pushed by a mix of humiliation and something deeper, older: exhaustion. Exhaustion from being treated like furniture, as if having a bucket in her hand meant she didn't have a mind. "The air system on this floor has a flaw," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. She rose slowly, still holding the bucket, and met Omar's eyes with a courage she didn't know she had. "The ventilation on the west side is unbalanced. The conference room gets at least 3 degrees warmer than the rest of the floor after 10 a.m. It's not a thermostat issue, it's the damper. The airflow regulator is stuck halfway open. That's why you always feel hot during long meetings." The silence that followed was nothing like the one before. It was dense, surprised, almost disbelieving. Omar blinked slowly, as if processing not just her words, but the audacity behind them. Maggie let out a nervous laugh, unsure how to react. And Charles? Charles tilted his head slightly, studying Miriam with a new kind of intensity, as if seeing for the first time someone who had been there all along. How do you know that?" he asked, and there was no condescension in his voice, only genuine curiosity, maybe even respect. Miriam shrugged, feeling the adrenaline start to fade, leaving behind a strange mix of pride and fear for what she'd just done. "I pay attention, and I read. It's not that hard if you actually notice things." Omar was still staring at her, but his smile had completely vanished, replaced by something that might have been intrigue or irritation. Hard to tell. As Miriam turned to finish mopping the spilled water, she could feel the weight of 3 pairs of eyes on her, each processing that moment in a different way. But it was Charles's voice, low and steady, that reached her just as she was about to leave. "Wait, please, don't go just yet."
The elevator was all mirrors, one of those sleek, modern designs that multiplied people into infinity, creating the illusion that you were never truly alone. Miriam avoided looking directly at the reflections, but it was impossible not to notice Charles Caldwell standing beside her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dress pants, his tie slightly loosened, as if he'd run a hand through it in a moment of tension. He had asked to accompany her down to the basement, claiming he needed to check something in the maintenance sector, an excuse so transparent that even Maggie had raised an eyebrow when she heard it. But there they were, descending 40 floors in silence, wrapped in the soft hum of the machinery and the weight of everything left on set. Miriam held on to the cleaning cart as if it were an anchor, something solid to ground her while her heart beat in a rhythm that didn't match the calm descent of the elevator. "How did you figure it out?" Charles's voice broke the silence, and Miriam nearly jumped. He wasn't looking at her directly, but at her reflection in the mirror, a strange kind of intimacy, talking through duplicated images. "About the damper, I mean. Most engineers we hire would spend days analyzing blueprints and systems before reaching that conclusion." Miriam bit her lip, hesitant. Part of her wanted to retreat, to sink back into the safe invisibility where no one asked questions and she didn't have to reveal herself. But another part, smaller, braver, the one that had awakened back in that conference room, wanted to speak, wanted to be heard. "Pay attention," she began carefully. "When you clean the same places every day, you start to notice patterns. The conference room always has that forced air smell, but only in the mornings. By afternoon, people start opening the windows, even when it's freezing outside. So I thought, either the system's failing or something's blocking the airflow. I looked up HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, and, well, the rest was deduction."
Charles turned toward her then, abandoning the reflection and meeting her eyes directly. There was something different in his expression. Not pity, not patronizing surprise, but genuine recognition, as if he were seeing an equal, not a subordinate. "You studied that on your own?" Miriam nodded, her cheeks flushing again, but this time it wasn't embarrassment. It was something warmer, closer to pride. "I study at night. I borrow books from the library, watch video lessons whenever I can get free Wi-Fi on the subway. Engineering has always fascinated me. The way things fit together,
how small adjustments can make entire systems work better. It's beautiful, you know? The logic behind the chaos. She stopped, realizing she was saying too much, revealing too much. But Charles didn't look bored or impatient. On the contrary, he was smiling. A small, almost shy smile that completely softened his usually stern face. "I know exactly what you mean," he said gently. "My father used to say the same thing. He said engineering was the art of making the impossible look inevitable." The elevator came to a soft halt in the basement, and the doors opened to a gray, functional hallway. So different from the luxury of the upper floors, it might have belonged to another building entirely, maybe even another world. Charles didn't move right away. He stood there, holding the door open with one hand, watching Miriam with an expression she couldn't quite read. Curiosity mixed with something deeper, maybe admiration, maybe even a hint of melancholy. "Miriam," he said. And it was the first time he'd spoken her name, making it sound less like a label and more like a discovery. "You shouldn't be cleaning floors. You should be designing them." Before she could respond, before she could process the weight of those words and the warmth they sparked in her chest, he was already gone, leaving her alone with the cart, the endless reflections in the mirrors, and the unsettling feeling that something fundamental had just shifted. Far above, on the upper floors, Maggie Rahman watched the elevator numbers descend on the digital panel, her arms crossed and a faint wrinkle forming between her brows. And for the first time working beside Charles, she wondered if she truly understood the intentions of the man she'd sworn to protect.
The rooftop on the 50th floor wasn't open to the public. It was one of those privileges reserved for people who signed seven-figure contracts and made decisions that moved markets. The wind blew with a force that seemed intent on pushing everything back down to the ground, making clothes flutter and hair rebel against any attempt at control. Miriam had never been up there before, but Charles had invited her with such effortless ease that refusing felt impossible, as if bringing a janitor to the executive terrace were the most natural thing in the world. Below them, New York stretched out like a glowing chessboard, and the city that once felt so vast and oppressive from the streets now seemed small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. "It's funny," Charles said, resting his arms on the glass railing, eyes fixed on the horizon where buildings bled into the sky. "From up here, everything looks manageable, small, almost insignificant. But the truth is, distance doesn't lessen the weight of things. It just creates the illusion of control." It had been a week since their elevator conversation, and in that week, something strange had happened. Charles had started seeking her out, not in any obvious or intrusive way, but through quiet, stolen moments. A question about the electrical system on the 12th floor, a casual remark about energy efficiency, even a shared coffee in an empty hallway at 6 in the morning when the world was still asleep and they could talk without an audience. And then, that Friday afternoon, he made the offer. "I want to create a position for you in the facilities department," he said, turning to face her with that serious tone that made every word sound like an oath. "Technical assistant with room to grow. You'd have access to formal training, certifications, everything you need. Your knowledge shouldn't be wasted holding a mop, Miriam. You deserve more." And for a moment, a bright, dangerous moment, she believed she really did. But the corporate world had its own laws, invisible hierarchies and unspoken codes that punished anyone daring enough to cross lines. The news of the offer leaked, of course. Secrets in glass towers had a shorter half-life than size. And the reaction was swift. Sideways glances in hallways, whispers that died when she walked by, even direct comments from employees who used to ignore her entirely. "Must be nice to have connections," one of the receptionists said with a venomous smile, and Miriam felt every word like a slap.
But worse than all that was Omar Al-Fahim. The investor had called an urgent meeting with Charles, and rumors spread through the floors like fire on dry paper. He was pressuring the CEO, threatening to pull a $50 million investment if the company persisted with its questionable hiring practices. The message was crystal clear. She was the problem. Her existence, her ambition, her audacity to want more had become a political liability. Maggie had tried to warn her. She appeared in the women's locker room one morning while Miriam was changing before her shift, and beneath her mask of professionalism, there was something that almost looked like compassion. Look, I get what Charles is trying to do, and honestly, I admire it. But Omar doesn't make empty threats. He'll tear this deal apart, ruin the company's reputation, make Charles look impulsive and reckless to the board. And in the end, who do you think will pay the highest price? You! She paused, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes the cost of being seen is just too high. Sometimes survival means staying invisible a little longer. Miriam had listened in silence, absorbing each word like blows that left no visible marks but hurt in all the places no one could see. And when she returned to the rooftop that afternoon, summoned by Charles for an important conversation, she already knew what was coming. The wind kept blowing, indifferent to human drama, and below them, the city pulsed with millions of lives, unaware that 50 floors above, a woman was about to learn that dreaming high came with a price she might not be able to pay. And then, Charles took a deep breath, and before he even spoke, Miriam saw something in his eyes that made her want to cry. Guilt, frustration, and the quiet heartbreak of a man forced to choose between what was right and what was possible.
The clock on the wall of Charles's office read 11:47 p.m., each tick echoing through the empty space with cruel precision, reminding him that time keeps moving even when you wish it would stop. He was alone. Maggie had left hours ago, leaving only a bottle of whiskey on the desk and a note that said, "You did what you had to do," as if absolution could be summed up in 8 handwritten words. Charles hadn't touched the drink. Instead, he sat there in the shadows, the city glittering outside the glass, mentally replaying every word he had said to Miriam that afternoon. Words calculated, strategic, wrapped in professional coldness that hid the fact that every syllable had hurt him as much as it had hurt her. "We need to reconsider the timing," he had said, using corporate jargon as a shield. "The position is still available, but maybe it's better to wait until the deal with Omar is finalized. You understand, right? It's just strategy." But Miriam had understood something entirely different. He had seen it in her eyes. Those brown eyes he had learned to read over the past few weeks, eyes that said more in silence than most people could in entire speeches. She had understood rejection. She had understood that, at the end of the day, she was still disposable, still the variable that could be adjusted when the numbers didn't add up. And worst of all, she hadn't yelled, hadn't cried, hadn't made any dramatic scene that might have given Charles the chance to explain himself, to fight, to show that this wasn't what he truly wanted. She had simply nodded, a small, contained motion of her head, and said in a voice so neutral it sounded empty, "Of course. I understand perfectly." And then she had left, leaving behind only the faint lavender scent of the cheap soap she used, and a void that seemed to suck the air right out of the office. In the days that followed, Miriam became invisible again. But this time it was a deliberate choice, a weaponized invisibility. She performed her duties with the same efficiency as always, but avoided the times she knew Charles would be in the halls. She stopped having coffee at 6 a.m., began using the service elevators exclusively, and when their paths inevitably crossed, she looked through him with an indifference so perfectly executed it hurt more than any accusation. Alessandra noticed, of course. "What happened between you two?" she asked one morning while helping unload supplies in the storage room. Miriam continued stacking boxes without looking up. Nothing happened. That's exactly the point. And there was such resignation in those words that even Alessandra, who always had an answer for everything, had nothing to say. She simply placed a hand on Miriam's shoulder and squeezed gently, a gesture that said everything words could not. "I'm sorry the world is like this. I'm sorry dreaming costs so much." Charles tried to convince himself he had made the right choice. The deal with Omar was progressing, the board was satisfied, and the company was on track to close the quarter with record numbers. On paper, it was success. But at night, when everyone had gone and the building was empty except for the night guards and cleaning staff, he found himself staring down the hallway, waiting to see a discreet silhouette pushing a cart, hoping for one more chance to... For what? To apologize? To admit he had chosen money over integrity? To admit that every time he signed a report or approved an acquisition, a part of him thought, Miriam would have a better solution for this? The silence on the 50th floor had never been so deafening. And it was in the middle of that suffocating silence, 3 weeks after that rooftop conversation, that Charles opened his email one Monday morning and found a message from Omar Al-Fahim with the subject line, "Have you seen this?" Attached was a link to a viral video, cell phone recording, average quality, but crystal clear audio. It was him, Charles Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Industries, openly arguing with Omar about the cleaning woman who's causing unnecessary problems. And Omar's voice, clear as water, saying, "Sometimes you need to remind people of their place." The video had 2 million views, and counting.
The letter was folded into 3 perfect sections, placed on Charlie's living room coffee table with a care that contrasted sharply with the urgency of the situation. He found it when he returned home at 3 in the morning, after 16 hours navigating the PR storm the video had unleashed. Canceled interviews, furious shareholders, trending topics on Twitter that turned his name into a synonym for corporate elitism. Maggie had been the one to leave the letter, accompanied by a yellow post-it in her angular handwriting. She stopped by this afternoon, asked me to give you this. Read it before doing anything stupid. Charles picked up the envelope with hands that trembled just slightly, not from exhaustion, but from something closer to fear. Fear that it was a final goodbye. Fear that Miriam had given up not only on him, but on the possibility that people like them could meet somewhere between the 50th floor and the basement. The handwriting was delicate, slightly slanted to the right, written in blue pen on lined paper that looked as though it had been torn from a school notebook. Charles, it began, without formalities or titles, just his name. And there was something deeply intimate in that simplicity. I watched the video like the rest of the world. I saw the comments, read the articles, heard the opinions. And in the middle of all that noise, I realized something you might need to hear. I'm not angry with you. I'm disappointed, yes. Hurt, certainly. But angry? Anger I reserve for those who act with deliberate cruelty, and you have never been cruel. You were human. You were someone trapped between what you believe and what the world expects, and I understand that better than you imagine, because I live in that prison every day. Charles had to pause for a moment, take a deep breath, let the words settle in his chest like heavy but necessary stones.
"But here's the thing about prisons," the letter continued, and Charles could almost hear her voice as he read. "They only exist as long as we keep believing the walls are real. And maybe the video, as painful as it is, did something important. It tore down a few walls. Now everyone knows what I am, the cleaning woman who dared to want more. And everyone knows what you did. You stepped back when the pressure got too strong. But do you know what else they will discover? How we respond now. Whether we let shame define us or whether we use it as fuel to build something different." Thank you, Charles. Thank you for showing me, even unintentionally, that I don't need your permission to be seen. I only need my own courage. And thank you for reminding me that even powerful people are fragile. That makes everything human, more possible." There was no signature, just her initials, MS, followed by a PS that read, "By the way, the problem isn't just the damper. There's a short circuit in the electrical panel on the 18th floor that will cause a fire if not addressed soon. Just thought you should know." Charles read the letter 3 times that night, and the next morning, when Maggie entered his office expecting to find him drowning in self-pity or strategic fury, she found him sitting upright, a cooling cup of coffee beside his computer, and an expression on his face she hadn't seen in years. Determination mixed with something dangerously close to hope. "Canceled the meeting with Omar," he said without taking his eyes off the screen, "and schedule a press conference for tomorrow." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Charles, are you sure? The legal department said it's best to stay quiet until—" "I know what they said," he interrupted gently, "but I've spent my whole life doing what's strategically safe, and look where it's gotten me. Maybe it's time to do what's right, regardless of the cost." He finally looked at her, and there was a clarity in his eyes Maggie hadn't expected. "She's right, Maggie, about the walls, about courage, about everything." And for the first time in weeks, Maggie smiled. Not the professional smile she wore in meetings, but a genuine, weary, half-sad, real smile. "Then I guess you already know what you need to do." Charles nodded, grabbed his coat, and headed for the elevator, leaving behind urgent reports and unanswered emails, because there was something far more urgent waiting for him 26 floors below, where Miriam Stevenson was cleaning the hallway for the last time before handing in her resignation letter.
Night had fallen over New York with that hurriedness characteristic of autumn days, when the sun seems eager to leave and casts the city in a violet twilight that lasts only a few minutes before surrendering to complete darkness. Miriam was alone on the 50th floor. She had specifically requested the night shift to avoid crowds, curious glances, and whispers that had followed her ever since the video went viral. Some people now recognized her on the streets, in the subway, and it was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because she was finally seen. Terrifying because being seen meant being vulnerable. She moved the mop across the floor one last time, circular, methodical motions her muscles knew by memory when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. Footsteps she had learned to recognize, steady but unhurried, confident but not arrogant. Charles. She didn't turn immediately. She kept cleaning, pretending not to notice him, but her heart betrayed her calm facade with a rhythm all its own. He stopped a few meters away, and she could feel the weight of his gaze on her back. The same gaze that had the strange ability to make her feel both exposed and protected at once. "I received your letter," he said finally, and his voice sounded different, not that controlled executive tone, but rougher, more vulnerable, as if he'd spent hours shouting, or maybe crying. "And you were right, about everything. About the walls, about courage, about my choosing safety over integrity." Miriam stopped cleaning then, but still didn't turn. She stood there, back to him, holding the mop as if it were the only solid thing in a world that refused to stop shaking. "I held a press conference today," Charles continued, and now she could hear something new in his voice, something dangerously close to a smile. "I canceled the deal with Omar, all 50 million. I publicly stated that a corporate culture that values profit over human dignity is not a culture I want to perpetuate." Miriam turned slowly, and what she saw stole the air from her lungs. Charles was different, not physically, perhaps, but there was something in the way he carried himself, a lightness in his shoulders, as if he had set down a burden he had carried for years. And in his eyes, those gray-blue eyes that he had so often seen filled with strategic calculation and suffocating responsibility, there was now only raw honesty.
The board will try to remove me," he said with the simplicity bordering on absurdity. "Shareholders are furious. I'll probably lose the company my father built. And you know what? I should be terrified. I should be questioning whether I made the right choice. But when I woke this morning and read your letter for the 5th time, the only thing I felt was relief."
He took a step toward her, then another, closing the distance with a caution that suggested fear of startling her, of breaking her. "You taught me something all the MBAs in the world couldn't," Charles said. "Miriam, you taught me that integrity isn't a long-term strategy. It's a daily choice. And I chose wrong before, but I'm here now to choose right." "Charles," Miriam began, but her voice faltered, choked by a mix of emotions that had no name. He was only a few steps away, and she could see her reflection in his eyes. Not the invisible cleaning woman, not the woman with the mop, but simply Miriam. Complete, seen, real. "I don't want you to clean up my mistakes," Charles said softly, and there was so much weight in those words that they fell between them like precious stones. "I don't want you as my assistant or my employee or any other title that suggests you exist to serve my vision. I want you to walk beside me, Miriam, as a partner, as an equal, as someone who reminds me every day that success without humanity isn't success. It's just empty noise in a building full of glass." He extended his hand, not in a business gesture or formality, but as an invitation, simple, vulnerable, completely without guarantees. "I can't promise it will be easy. I can't promise the world will understand or accept it, but I can promise that I will never again choose safety over you. Never again." And Miriam, mop still in one hand, her heart pounding as if it wanted to burst from her chest, looked at that outstretched hand and understood that it wasn't just about romance or passion or any of the pretty words people use to describe connection. It was about choosing courage over fear. It was about believing she deserved to be there, on that floor, in that life, in that love. And when she finally placed her hand in his, their fingers intertwining, and the world not collapsing, but seeming to realign into a truer, more honest configuration, she whispered the only words that made sense. "Let's build something better, together." Outside, the sun began to rise over the New York skyline, painting the glass of the 50th floor in shades of orange and gold, transforming the space that had been the stage of so much pain into the backdrop of a new beginning. And reflected in that glass, two silhouettes, no longer separated by floors, status, or fear, but united by the bravest choice of all, the choice to believe that love, when genuine, is always worth the cost.
6 months later, on a spring morning when New York finally seemed to forgive the harsh winter that had battered the city, Miriam walked down Fifth Avenue with a lightness in her step she was only just learning to recognize as her own. Sunlight filtered through the new leaves of the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the pavement, and she found herself smiling for no particular reason, or perhaps for every reason, all at once. In the canvas bag slung over her shoulder, among textbooks on structural calculus and notebooks filled with notes on material strength, hung a gear-shaped keychain that Charles had given her on the day she started university classes. "Because everything moves," he had said, closing her fingers around the small metal object, "and you are the force that makes everything turn better." She hadn't cried that day, but she had come close. Not out of sadness, but from that rare kind of emotion that arises when you finally understand that dreams don't have to remain dreams forever. The transition hadn't been easy, of course. Nothing worthwhile ever is. Charles had lost his CEO position just as predicted, but had left the company with his dignity intact and a clear vision of what he wanted to build. He now ran a consultancy focused on corporate sustainability and ethical practices, smaller,
less profitable, infinitely more meaningful. Maggie had left with him, naturally, but not before having a long, honest conversation with Miriam at a corner cafe, where she admitted her old feelings for Charles and, surprisingly, blessed their relationship with a sincerity only possible from someone who had finally made peace with her own heart. "Take good care of him," she had said, squeezing Miriam's hand across the table. "And let him take care of you too. You're both terrible at accepting help." Alessandra continued supervising the cleaning team, but now with better pay and decent benefits, courtesy of an anonymous donation everyone knew the source of, but no one mentioned.
Miriam had applied to study civil engineering at City College, not because it was the most prestigious, but because it allowed her to study at night while working during the day as an intern at Charles's company. She still cleaned occasionally, not out of obligation, but by choice, because she had learned there was no shame in honest work, only in how society treated those who did it. And on the nights when Charles worked late and she returned from campus with eyes burning from fatigue, they would meet in the small office he rented on the 12th floor of a far less glamorous building than the previous one, sharing reheated Chinese takeout as she explained theorems and he pretended to understand half of what she said. There was an intimacy in those moments that went beyond physical romance or passion. It was the intimacy of two people who had chosen to build something together, brick by brick, mistake by mistake, and small victory by small victory. Miriam's phone vibrated in her pocket, and she stopped in the middle of the sidewalk to check it. A message from Charles. "Remember that proposal I mentioned? The sustainable housing project for low-income families? We got the funding, and the client wants you as the assistant engineer on the project. Your professors must have spoken too highly of you." Miriam read the message twice, 3 times, until the words finally pierced the barrier of disbelief and transformed into tangible reality. She squeezed the gear key chain in her palm, feeling the sharp edges press into her skin, grounding her in the moment. A year ago, she had been invisible. 6 months ago, she had gone viral for all the wrong reasons. And now, standing on that sunlit sidewalk, with the future unfolding before her like a door she had finally learned to walk through, Miriam Stevenson understood something fundamental. It wasn't about no longer being the woman with the mop. It was about never again letting the mop define who she was. She typed her reply, a simple "on my way," followed by a heart emoji she still used sparingly, but used nonetheless, and continued walking toward the subway. The gear on the keychain swung with each step, catching the morning light, turning gently. And everything, absolutely everything, kept moving.
The story of Miriam and Charles reminds us of something the world often tries to make us forget. True love isn't about grand cinematic gestures or perfectly timed words. It's about the courage to choose integrity when the easier path would be to turn your back. It's about seeing beyond appearances, titles, and the hierarchies society builds to keep us separated in neatly labeled safe boxes. Miriam didn't need to stop being herself to deserve love. She needed to find someone who could see her value when the rest of the world insisted on looking through her as if she were glass. And Charles didn't need to lose everything to find meaning. He needed to understand that success without humanity is just an empty reflection in a glass skyscraper. Just as they discovered that love can change everything, each of us carries this power for transformation within ourselves. The real question has never been whether we deserve to be seen, but whether we have the courage to stop hiding. Stories like this remind us that it's never too late to start over and believe in love. Not just romantic love, but self-love that allows us to say, "I deserve more," without apology. They remind us that the deepest connections often arise in the most unexpected places, between people society insists should remain apart. And they show us that true passion isn't the kind that burns fast and disappears. It's the kind that warms slowly, transforms,
and endures even when everything around it collapses. The desire to be seen, to be loved, to belong, these aren't luxuries reserved for those on the highest floors. They are fundamental human rights, pulsing in each heartbeat we carry.
If this story touched you in some way, if you saw yourself in Miriam fighting to be heard, or in Charles learning that vulnerability is not weakness, leave a comment saying, "Love transforms lives." These 4 words are not just a pretty phrase. They're a declaration that you believe in the possibility of change, growth, and finding beauty in the most unexpected places. They are a reminder that your story is still being written and that the most moving chapters may be just ahead, waiting for you to have the courage to turn the page. Subscribe to Eternal Romance Stories and experience with each episode emotions that warm the soul and reflections that transform the heart. Here you'll find stories that don't just entertain, but make you question, feel, and above all believe that love in all its forms is possible. That human connection is stronger than any wall we try to build between us, and the tenderness, even in the hardest moments, is what keeps us fundamentally human. Because in the end, we are all made of the same hopes, the same fears, the same deep longing to be seen and loved exactly as we are. And this was just one of many stories that will move you here,